Thank you very much. And thank you, Arthur, and thank you, AEI, for having this event. And thank all of you for being here. And it's good to be with Jim Wallace, and I agree with that really a lot with what he said. I'm speaking more as a Republican member of the House with regard to the vulnerable and the poor from my own perspective. My convictions regarding the common good are centered in my faith as a follower of Jesus and grounded in the broader Judeo-Christian tradition. Looking to scripture passages like Isaiah 58 and later Luke 4, which speaks of loosing the chains of injustice and untying the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and of sharing our food with the hungry and providing shelter for the wanderer, I am compelled, because of my faith, to have compassion for the weak and vulnerable in our midst. In 1998, Pastor Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian Church gave a sermon entitled, Blessed Are the Poor, which has greatly informed my own thinking. Keller said there is nothing clearer in Scripture than our duty to care for the poor. He describes poverty as both an economic and social condition. The first necessitates we respond with mercy, the second with justice. These virtues of mercy and justice have a place in both our private lives and also in our shared national experiences. As one entrusted with public service, I hope to speak today about the latter and specifically about what my party, the Republican Party, can do to champion the cause of the vulnerable. Interestingly, research reveals that care for the poor, hatred of oppression, fairness, or universal moral concerns among Americans define a party affiliation and even religious identity. In a recent Wall Street Journal piece, Arthur rightly notes that the Republicans are losing the battle when we hand an argument over with nearly 100% public support, care for the vulnerable, to the other side. Some suggest that Republicans can only reverse recent electoral trends by compromising on core principles, including oft-characterized values, issues like life and marriage. This is the wrong place to start, both in principle and politically. I suggest, as AEI's own Mark Thiessen, I don't know if he's here or not, aptly did in the Washington Post piece headline, What Republicans Can Learn from Pope Francis. That is, that the GOP's problem today is not that it is too socially conservative, it is that Republicans are seen as defenders of the rich and powerful instead of the poor and the vulnerable. Pope Francis defies the labels. He is theologically and doctrinally conservative. At the same time, a Reuters headline the day after his selection proclaimed, World welcomes Pope Francis as humble champion of the poor. His traditionalist views, partnered with his focus on the vulnerable and marginalized, make him an appealing enigma. It would be good if the same could be said of my party. The irony, politically speaking, is that Republican policy approaches on many issues, being it prison reform, school choice, anti-trafficking initiatives, and even welfare, are superior. But because we marginalize these issues, and even at times the people affected by them, we have lost the opportunity to influence the electorate and, more importantly, to effect long-term systemic change. This is politically troubling if we are ever to hope to be a governing party again, and more importantly, morally indefensible. 21st Century Initiatives recently released a paper titled, Can We Be Caring and Principled? A Strategic Agenda for American Conservatives, which points out that the caricature of conservative candidates as uncaring and focused only on the source and focus on the rich. It concludes that these prescriptions have led critical masses of voters to increasingly base their votes on the perceived decency of one side rather than the value of the competing ideas of each side. They call this the caring issue. The strategic agenda put forward in Can We Be Caring and Principled, an alternative antidote aptly called the Wilberforce Agenda, in keeping with the great 19th century abolitionists and statesmen. In that vein, I challenge leaders in both parties who relish concluding their speeches by beseeching the Almighty to bless this land, but who prefer to relegate matters of religion and conscience to the private sphere, to recall that throughout our history, Throughout our history of America and even before that, it has been people of faith in the public square who have inspired decent and virtuous campaigns against slavery, crime, slums, child labor, and segregation. Such a Wilberforce agenda prioritizes how, at low cost or even sometimes no cost, human rights and human dignity initiatives which exemplify, caring, and peacefully transform the lives of millions. 21st Century Initiatives paper is required reading for any serious conservative. In the weeks ahead, a group of lawmakers, including myself, will send a copy to every Republican member of Congress and urge a conversation on the ideas it puts forward. Republicans must begin to advance these issues in our communications with the American people and in our legislative agenda in Congress, and also, perhaps more importantly, in practice. I underscore the latter because this is not merely a messaging, pollster-type issue. As the late Jack Kemp, who was a mentor of mine, said, people don't care about how much you know until they know how much you care. We can't just pillory the teachers' unions and sound the free market trumpet. We must visit the failing schools. We must talk to the mother who desperately wants more for her child and offer a constructive way out. We can't simply lambaste the abuse of food stamps or decry dependency. We must harness the resources of our houses of worship, civic organizations, and business communities to fill the shelves of food banks, offering a helping hand to the needy in our midst. We can't just rail against crime. We must speak of the root problems, devastating family breakups, an insidious culture of violence that cheapens human life, skyrocketing prison recidivism rates that rob our communities of husbands and fathers, and recognize that there is a societal and governmental role in rehabilitation and restoration. In this time that I have left, I'd like to put forward some broad stroke ideas, but they can honestly do that I believe would benefit the common good, as Mr. Wallace said, and embraced by Republican leaders, could communicate in unequivocal terms that the grand old party can in fact be the home of any American who yearns to see a nation that is marked by mercy and justice and is committed to the vulnerable. In the world's wealthiest nation, roughly 49 million Americans, or 1 in 6, struggle to put enough food on the table at some point during the year. 25 million depend on food banks and other charities. This is especially striking given that in America, there is no scarcity of food. Yes, it is important for government to provide a safety net for those who fall on hard times. But is the provision of a safety net analogous to the government actively recruiting Americans to sign up for food stamps? And is it even compassionate to do so in the face of exploding national debts and deficits and further cuts to domestic discretionary spending, including food stamps, which are all but inevitable? According to the Wall Street Journal, food stamp enrollment has soared 70% since 2008 to a record 47.8 million people as of December 2012. On an April 24 Washington Post story featured the work of a food stamp recruiter whose job it was to, quote, enroll at least 150 seniors for food stamps each month, a quota she usually exceeded. I mention this not to vilify food stamps. Rather, I wish to convey that domestic hunger is a serious problem, one that every American, black and white, rich or poor, Republican or Democrat, must care about. Further, the federal government presently provides 96% of the money spent on food assistance, 96%, whereas private charity provides a mere 4%. That is both unacceptable and unsustainable given our current fiscal woes as a nation. What if every company, Rotary, Kiwanis Club, Civic Association, PTA, law firm, and school were to twice a year, and not just at Thanksgiving and Christmas, hold a food drive to restock and replenish the empty shelves of our nation's food pantries and raise awareness about the hungry in our midst? What if farmers were to set aside an acre of land for the local Boy Scout group or Girl Scout group to cultivate and then donate their bounty to the area food bank? What if a government were to incentivize farmers to set aside land for the purpose of gleaning? What if this agricultural contribution to the public good qualified as a charitable gift? What if every governor had someone on the staff dedicated to tackling hunger in their state? What if this person was tasked with reaching out to every restaurant owner, every public school, every farmer, every food bank in the state, with the aim of connecting those with more than enough to those with not nearly enough? After meeting with my district food banks several years ago, I learned that local schools were throwing excess food out because they had received misguided advice that they could be sued if they donated it. So in 2011, I sponsored, through the good work of my friend Tony Hall, legislation was passed into law clarifying once and for all that schools are able to donate under the Good Samaritan Act, explicitly permitted them to donate without fear of suit. That has made a big difference in the Fairfax County area, and it could make a tremendous difference around the country. The needs are seemingly insurmountable, but so are the possibilities. These and other ideas could be, and I hope will be, explored in a bipartisan hunger commission bill, which I'm introducing in this Congress. Surely we can agree that domestic hunger is unacceptable, and that in the land of plenty, even during time of relative austerity, none should be left waiting. Trafficking of persons. America recently celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And yet today, slavery in the form of human trafficking still exists. The State Department reports that nearly 27 million people around the world are victims of this crime in its various manifestations. But what is less known is that human trafficking is endemic in our own country. There are 82 trafficking centers in Northern Virginia alone that Polaris did a study for. And recently there was a case in McLean involving alleged domestic servitude at the home of a Saudi diplomat. With the explosive growth of the internet, good things have come from the internet, but bad things have come from the internet. Pimps, johns, gangs, traffickers, madams, and the like have expanded their criminal activity to new heights. They have penetrated our nation's neighborhoods in Northern Virginia, schools in Northern Virginia, and victimized our children while shaking and cloaking themselves in a misguided claims of free speech whenever they or the websites they use are under scrutiny. Among such websites are Backpage.com, which has been found to serve as a conduit for the buying and selling of human beings, and not just prostitutions. More specifically, the trafficking of minors. They do so to the tune of millions of dollars. I have repeatedly asked this Justice Department without any response, with zero response, to provide an analysis of whether there are sufficient laws on the books to prosecute the type of activity that Backpage.com engages in, and if not, to put recommendations forward to Congress of legislative initiatives that may be undertaken to equip law enforcement to tackle this problem. This complex and growing phenomenon targets the young and the very, very vulnerable. Ought not my party, the party of Lincoln, take up the abolitionist cause of our day? Prisons. And I see one or two people that worked with Chuck Colson. Colson was a mentor. The U.S. has the dubious distinction of holding the highest incarceration rates in the world. A 2010 Pew Charitable Trust study found that 2.3 million Americans, 1 in 15 African Americans, are behind bars. There are tremendous financial costs associated with a prison population that size, but more importantly, there is a human toll that can hardly be measured. While violent crime is at a record low nationally, we are sending more Americans to prison and often housing them with the most violent elements, including brutal gangs that are beginning to control a large portion of our prisons. Read what took place up in Baltimore County. Federal recidivism rates are shameful. Tragically, the roughly 2.7 million children who have a parent behind bars is substantially more likely to go to prison later on in their lives. Rather than focus on reform and providing job training and drug treatment programs during incarceration, the U.S. has substantially reduced these opportunities for the betterment in recent decades. It is a time that we reverse these trends by bringing together top experts to serve on the Chuck Colson Prison Reform Recidivism Reduction Commission, named after Chuck Colson, whose own personal journey was marked by redemption and grace, which instilled in him the great compassion for the prisoner. I intend to introduce legislation to create the commission which would consider everything with regard to from prison work to prison rape, to gangs, to recidivism, and much more. These experts could closely examine what is happening at the state level in places like Texas, where the prison population has experienced reduced recidivism rates due to treatment programs for drug offenders and the mentally ill. International. Much of what I've focused on thus far is domestic in scope, but the carrying issues go beyond our borders. President Ronald Reagan famously described the U.S. Constitution as a covenant we have made not only with ourselves, but with all of mankind. He understood that the promises enshrined in that document transcended time, they transcended place. Reagan consistently made human rights and religious freedom a hallmark of American diplomacy. Sadly, watching where we are today, that moral clarity has been lost. Consider the following. This administration continues to provide millions in precious foreign aid assistance to the Muslim Brotherhood without conditions. I was in Egypt 3 months ago talking to the Christian Coptic community. They live in fear, and they believe we are the number one supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they cannot understand. And the Baha'is live in fear, and the Ahmadis live in fear, and yet this continues. The administration ignores bipartisan congressional calls to place Vietnam on the State Department's list of the most egregious religious freedom violators. Despite crackdown on people of faith and an overall deteriorating human rights situation, preferring instead a policy defined simply by trade. This administration is silent about and the last administration was too, about the brutal gulags enslaving thousands in North Korea, and can barely muster an objection when the Chinese government fails to honor its international obligations to North Korean refugees by deporting them to an almost certain death sentence. These examples, and countless others like them, underscores the covenant that Reagan spoke of, risk being broken to the detriment of the vulnerable people the world over. I'm committed, and I want the Republican Party. I'm not speaking for you. I want my party, the Republican Party today. I want us to really be committed whereby the party of Lincoln, the party of Reagan, is once again entrusted by the American people with a sacred obligation of governance. And I believe in what Jim Wallace said is true. There is a dysfunction and there is a lack of trust with regard to Washington. I find the same thing everywhere I go, whether it be the administration, whether it be the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. There is not a trust out in the community. Lincoln believed in the inherent dignity and equality of every man, woman, and child. He strove to preserve the Union, but not at the expense of injustice. He appealed to the better angels of our nature. Reagan, too, saw America as a shining city on a hill, a land of great opportunity and promise, the last best hope for man on earth. It is in this tradition that my party, the Republican Party, must once again find its voice on behalf of the most vulnerable, not simply because polling data indicates that this is a winning approach, but rather because our conscience compels us to. As a man of faith who has clay feet, and when I take off my socks, the clay is all over my floor, I am under no illusions that government, expansive or limited, has within its reach the key to our society's ills. Nor do I think that any single system, even I will say it here at the AEI, and I agree with Jim Wallace on that point, even the free market capitalism or democracy can guarantee that all the vulnerable are safe and well cared for. However, I maintain that the American experiment in all its imperfections is a glorious one inspired by profound ideas that are without equal in human history. Liberty is a birthright, individual human life is sacred, and freedom is God-given. These notions are grounded in the Judeo-Christian ethos. They are the touchstones of our republic. And I would argue they are at the heart of conservatism. Yes, conservatism, not liberalism. They are at the heart of conservatism. And if embraced and acted upon, they hold great promise for the poor, the vulnerable, and the oppressed of our nation and beyond. Thank you very, very much. you.